Hi, everybody. I'm going to probably apologize now because I tend to be extremely high energy. So if you are sleeping or feeling like a little bit down, this is definitely going to wake you up. I am extremely excited to talk to you three because you're probably some of my favorite people in this space. But Juan, your presentation just now almost answered every question I had previously written. So we might have to wing it a little bit and ask a couple more. I feel like before this summit, I had a ton of questions about coordination, and I apologize. I am one of the people at GetCoin that comes from the builder side of it, so I'm very intense on public goods and building and creating a new world from the ground up, and so that might be a lot of the questions that I have. But I think in order to really start the conversation, I'm going to have a good definition of what is a public good, and then we can talk about public goods for the planet. So I thought I'd turn to you, Kevin, on what is a public good?
Sure. Yeah. Can you all hear me? Oh, there we go. Oh, wow. Okay. So a public good, the economic definition is something that's non-excludable and non-rivalrous. So an example is a piece of open source software, Gloria. If you pull it down onto your computer, it's non-rivalrous. It actually, I can pull it down on my computer, and no one can exclude you from downloading open source software because the code's available for free online. So that's a digital public good, open source software, but we're all breathing clean air in a livable climate. Those things are public goods. Information in a democracy is a public good. There are many public goods out there, and this is opposed to private goods like stuff you can get on Amazon.com, where if I buy a DVD, then you can't get it because it's rivalrous. And so that's the definition of public goods. And one of the things that is actually really interesting about digital public goods that I'll just say before I hand it back to you is some of them are anti-rivalrous. So open source software, for example, gets better the more people download it. Maybe you'll submit a patch to my code that I didn't document. Sorry, I didn't document my code. And so network goods are public goods that are anti-rivalrous and get better the more people use them, which is somewhat interesting. So that's the definition of public goods.
Okay, perfect. And so when I think of the planet as a public good, you said of course, air is one of the aspects of it, but there are many other components now when we start to talk about sustainability that have been somewhat, traditionally held by certain people, but now if we could use some of those aspects given to everybody else, then it makes it good for everybody else. And so I know we had a lot of talks about decarbonizations and things like that, but I really wanted to understand a little bit more about the sustainability markets and how Web3 being injected into that and maybe bringing their ethos could be beneficial for the world as a whole as well. So Alan, maybe I'll turn it to you and see, what Web3 ethos can become if we were at the cross-section of both sustainability and Web3.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of that comes to this planetary boundaries framework, which Juan was talking about, and I touched on earlier. It's not just emissions and the climate, right? There are these 8 categories of variables that scientists have defined as saying, okay, if these variables are within a safe range, then the ecosystem, the planet we live on, is stable, right? These are things like fresh water use. These are things like biodiversity. These are things like phosphorus and nitrogen flows, right? That we need all of these variables to stay within this safe range, right? And climate change, right? The amount of CO2 and CO2 equivalent gases in the atmosphere is one of these variables, and it's outside of that safe range. That's a problem. But we need to do things like protect biodiversity, right? We have, during the Anthropocene age right now, we have this tremendous loss in biodiversity that's historic and caused by humans, and it's of course coupled, right, to things like climate change. But so I think part of where we can have tremendous impact is to come up with ways, like Juan was talking about, build the basis for impact evaluators and build the impact evaluators themselves in order to understand where those variables are, right? So how can we measure biodiversity? How can we measure land use? How can we measure fresh water? How can we measure all of these different variables, right, that we all depend on for having a livable planet? And then can we experiment with ways of keeping them within that safe zone and rewarding people for keeping them within that safe zone? And I think that a huge reason that we haven't made more progress on that over the past several decades is that the velocity of experimentation was very low, right? And so by unlocking all of these new Web3 native mechanisms for verifying all this data and then connecting that to incentive mechanisms, we really have this opportunity to just unlock this massive diversity in potential ways, right, of monitoring and then incentivizing people to keep those variables within the right range. And that's what we need to do over the next decade.
Within those incentive mechanisms too, would you be able to like make a like economic systems where those who were like the most impacted by like the change within the climates could then verify the differences that were happening in their communities and then be able to be like economically rewarded and have that as like a model where they could like buy into the benefit of the system then?
Yeah, 100%. And like some of the most exciting projects in the space are things like the Regen Network, Gain Forest, Open Forest Protocol. These projects that are that are doing exactly that, right? Like what we are making visible to the project is the actual like on the ground impact, right? And you're connecting these incentive structures such that they benefit, right? Whoever is actually like living near this plot of land that you want to protect, right? And like really doing a deep dive and understanding what does this community need and how can we support them in protecting the biodiversity of the place they live, for example?
Okay, cool. I know, Juan, I heard you talk before about like within the industry and the infrastructure, like net zero might not be the goal that we should really be going towards. And I was wondering if you could like explain that a little bit more and like how could we go further than net zero and like what needs to be true in order to make that happen?
Yeah, so the problem here is that the growth of carbon in the atmosphere is so steep, and the increase in temperature and so on and other effects are so steep that our individual actions right now trying to get to net zero like are improving or helping, but they're not enough to unwind everything that we've done. So think of it kind of like if you go in to any kind of public place like a park or a beach or something, and you have to account for the fact that there will be other damage and so on that is beyond what you're accounting for yourself, and that you're not going to get perfect participation. So you have to build structures where you get everybody to work harder together to both improve the problem really quickly to try and unwind what we're doing, let the people that know it's important to and can to have as much effect as possible while we kind of drag everyone else on board later. So this, of course, calls into question, hey, what about like free riders? Like if some group gets to neutral and other groups are not, then like how is that fair? And this is where I think retroactive rewards can be really helpful. And this is one of these things where if you think forward into later and create instruments that can reward this kind of action in the future, you can give groups the tooling that they need to just be able to be unlocked and go as fast as they can to improving the problem, separate from any other groups that are not paying attention to the problem or are unwilling to comply with protocols yet, and so on. So I think like the goal set that the communities should have right now, those of us in these communities that understand the gravity of the problem and are trying to do something, don't set the goal at 0. Set the goal to have some multiple over what you use. So imagine being like 5x green or 10x green or some kind of multiple like that. So and then cause a competition between all groups to have as high of a multiple as you can and a high total, right? So that multiple is going to be multiplied by your actual use, and then it's going to relate to some actual total impact. Think of creating incentive structures like that enable the smaller groups that are doing this right now to have outsized impact relative to the rest of the groups. And then later think of ways of rewarding those contributions after the fact. One really good thing is that because we're tracking all of this information, those retroactive rewards are possible. And so it's one of these things where like, sometimes people, sometimes I go through and like donate to projects after they happened, or like buying art is a good example of this. Like you're giving a retroactive reward so that more of that work happens. Like buying an art piece is a way of saying, I really value this art. I want more like it to happen, and I want to reward the people involved in both its production and stewarding over time and so on. So think of like ways of creating those retroactive reward structures to enable that kind of like much faster activity. And so in the Falcon project, like we have been talking about this of like, hey, first let's get to zero across the entire system, so not just the energy use, but also later on like the hardware development. Like hardware is a huge part of like you taught me about this. The hardware is a huge part of the emission rate and other environmental impacts, like drawing tons of like minerals from grounds and like bad mining facilities and all kinds of like problems. Let's set the goal to like instrument the whole thing and get to zero, but let's not stop there. Along any part, let's try and get to be carbon negative, so very strongly climate positive.
Awesome. Some of the talks that I've heard this whole day was talking about like the tokenization of decarbonizing the planet, which I thought was a really good application for blockchain, but I feel like there's even more that blockchain technology can do. And Kevin, I wanted, from your perspective, like what are other opportunities that we could like inject into the sustainability space where blockchain could be used for something else that would be impactful?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the answer is quadratic funding, obviously.
It always is.
Yeah. Which is actually not my idea. It's Vitalik and Glenn's. We're just implementing it. I mean, I think that, the fruitful space that I see here is that we've got these global coordination failures, and we've got this global coordination substrate that is Ethereum. And so what properties does the substrate have? It's transparent, which means that we have the same access that like the Fed board does. It's open source, which means that we can change it and fork it. It's global, which means that it can have impact across the world, and I think that global thing is really important for solving global coordination failures. And then it's programmable, which means that you can build these little state machines on top of it that can replace entire institutions that used to need to have budgets of millions of euros per year. And that's like kind of the design space, and we're in this primordial soup of like a Cambrian explosion of different things that are going to be experimenting in that. And so for me, I think about like the biological metaphor of like a Cambrian explosion of things growing in different directions, and you have some things that are like you're gonna have some things that just like grow and they collapse like 3 R's Capital or like UST or something. Like they're just like cancers that are just focused on growth, and then they like die because they consume their hosts and they implode. And then so if you look at this in like a biological systems metaphor, like we're gonna evolve past these epochs of these collapses, and that's gonna filter out the projects that aren't gonna make it, and then the next projects will inform the next form of evolution. And I think we're gonna like evolve forward these cryptoeconomic systems until we get to the equivalent of like mammals or mycelial networks or stuff like that. And so I like speed running that evolution is what's really kind of where I think is cool. And so I really like the idea that Juan proposed. I actually learned this from your talk right now, is the impact evaluators, is that basically you can create a plurality of mechanisms that evaluate the impact, and there can be like a marketplace of them, and we can speed run that evolution faster because we're building a cryptoeconomic force to reward people who are having an impact on the world, and it's relative to local values, not like me as this like person from Colorado. Like it should be local to the like everyday community's values, and speed running that evolution is really I think an important thing. And what I'm trying to do to accelerate that evolution is I'm just trying to figure out the mimetic shelling points that to help the capital markets and the talent understand that there's going to be a capital and talent rotation into projects that have object level impact in the next cycle. And it won't be projects that had the best Ponzi-nomics in the last cycle. So let's front run that by start channeling capital and talent into regen projects over the next the next couple years, and I think that helping capital and talent find those best projects is the highest leverage point that I can think of right now.
Can I riff on that for a minute?
Please do.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, right? You're talking about how the projects that create the most value in this sense, right, are going to be the projects that do the best, especially in an economic downturn. Lucia from the Eternals NFT project was talking about exactly that. That like as they were looking at like which NFTs really collapsed, it's the NFTs that are connected to something interesting, right, and like have utility that do the best. In talking about tokenizing carbon, right, and sort of impact certificates, we had this great discussion earlier, a couple hours ago, about all of these amazing projects that are working to build Web3 native carbon offsets. And in Filecoin Green, we think a lot about the underlying data structures that are going to be necessary for all of this, and then also a lot about the governance, right? And I think that really gets to your question also of like, what can you really build in Web3 that you can't build using pre-Web3 tools, right?
Yeah.
And so one project and sort of direction there that I wanted to highlight is this emerging project called CO2.storage, in which we are aiming to take the metadata associated with offsets and take all the data schemas and structures there that you need in order to make offsets interoperable, and just have a simple utility that allows you to just take that data, store it on Filecoin, and then it just gives you a CID that you can do whatever you want with that CID, right? So we're not opinionated as to how you should structure all of your sort of incentives to do with offsets, because we believe a ton of experiments need to be done there, and we're really inspired by everything people are doing in that space. But we want to solidify this data layer, right, so that you can compare offsets. Right, that's what we want.
Well, I know
Right.
I know you and I had talked about this before, and if you're someone who, like, for me, had no clue like how offsets were even traced or like stored, even, it was like somewhat frightening. So will you just for one moment go over the whole process of it, because I think it shows like a bottleneck as to where the data is, and for someone who really likes to give data to people so they can build upon it, that whole current solution just doesn't seem like it works really well.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are there are existing registries, so like Vera and Gold Standard and these other registries. This is for the voluntary carbon markets. They have a bunch of experts who really know what they're doing, who evaluate methodologies, and then those methodologies are applied to projects that are then able to register offsets within these registries, right? And so then those offsets are what's sold to these end users. And I think a lot of these registries, have done a lot of really good work, right? And we're sort of set up using the best tools that they could at the time they were set up, right? But what we're trying to do is just add this sort of supercharge offsets with this sort of level of transparency and granularity and verifiability, and then interoperability, right, that you just like fundamentally cannot get with Web 1 and Web 2 systems. Right, and because you're when you're trying to figure out, like, you buy an offset, you're trying to figure out what you actually bought, you're like going through PDFs that are written in all these different languages and trying to figure out, like, okay, it's a nature-based offset, it theoretically should correspond to some like polygon of like afforested land or something, and it's very difficult to, in some cases, like just figure out what this offset actually means, right? And so, there's a ton of amazing projects, right, that are working in our space to try to fix that. And we just want, being the data storage layer of Web3, we want to help sort of solidify that and allow people to easily store data in schemas that are interoperable so that you can figure out what the offset actually is, right? And so then the next level right above that is sort of governance, right? Which is like, okay, we have some notion of an offset. We have the data layer in place, right? Then how do we make claims that we feel good about as a community, right? So, you may get offsets from all these different projects, but if you want to match those offsets to something, how do you do that? And how do you be transparent about the actual process of doing that? Like, what is that decision-making process? So we want to increase the velocity of experiments. And so if you're on the Wi-Fi network here, hopefully you are. I think the password is George52017. Presumably it was set 5 years ago. I don't know. So you can either scan this QR code that's on the door, or you can go to, I think it's tinyurl.com/sbs-emissions, and please enter there what your transportation information was to get here. And what we're going to do with that information is we're going to have a transparent process where we get offsets that have some sort of good data layer associated with them, right? And we are going to have experts, likely the speakers from the conference. There's a GitHub repo there. If you have ideas on how we should set up this governance system, please let us know. Just submit a PR there. Maybe I should ask you how to set this up. So we're gonna take a bunch of offsets. We're gonna have them be transparently evaluated as to the permanence, the additionality, the properties that you want in offsets. And then we're going to match those offsets with an aggregated carbon accounting of the emissions due to transportation to get to this conference, right? And the goal for that is to just do an experiment, right? Just like take offsets with a really good data layer, take some, you're talking about sprinkling verifiability into existing systems, right? And to be transparent about the evaluation of how we are matching, CO2 due to transportation to those projects.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing too, by the way. I appreciate that. I think one of the things that I am most impacted from the talks today was that there seems to be like an area of focus on like trying to find the perfect number sometimes and trying to find the perfect vessel. And I was wondering, when we start to remove perfectionism, is there an opportunity to fail forward in a way that when we build in public is accessible to everybody else? And like what would be the benefit if we all start to like use public goods funding to fund some of these projects that are giving it a try? So I know that we just had the hackathon and we'll have the results like tomorrow from the judging process, but if the data is public, what can we do like to not only have these projects but actually fund them, and like have us be the funding mechanisms where we like use our nation states and all the NGOs as a source of data, but like all the moving towards our goals actually happen from us to people funding them like themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's, in that 90-minute discussion, right, we just heard from people leading a bunch of projects that each have their own answer to like what that funding structure looks like. And I think what I'm really excited about, right, is to see, increasingly sort of see what works, right? Because you can go directly to people on the ground without these like massive non-transparent intermediaries in ways that you just like fundamentally could not before, right? And especially if you can correlate this with satellite data that's updated every 2 weeks, and like see like this thing I am theoretically protecting, is it actually still there, right? And do all of this in a way where everything is content addressed, and you can just make these like unambiguous claims. And verify them over time. I think like that's the bedrock we need, right, in order to set up those types of incentive mechanisms, right, and funding mechanisms. And so I guess the answer is like there's a ton of answers, and I can't wait to see like which ones are right in which dimensions.
Which ones are wrong? Yeah.
I was just going to inject there. I'm a big fan of recursion and simplicity, and as you were speaking, what I was kind of thinking is like, we're trying to figure out which impact evaluator is the best impact evaluator, so we need an impact evaluator for all the impact evaluators, and it's impact evaluators all the way down.
What could go wrong?
Yeah.
But does it have to be like which one's the best, or these ones are good?
Well, okay, so best is over a bad word, because there's not one global maxima. Relative to the value systems of local communities of people, there's going to be the best thing for the community impact outfit. Yeah.
And it's the best so far. Like it might not be the best later because you come up with something better.
Mm-hmm. And ultimately it's a network in which each impact evaluator is generating knowledge at like a different abstraction level, right? And so it's like it's a coordination system with the goal of generating knowledge about like how to solve certain types of problems.
Yeah, so a question that I have too, and I will get quick before, I will give you audience the chance to ask questions in a second too, but this might be the last one I have. It was really hot 2 days ago, and I know a lot of times we talk about climate and climate solutions with our pain point being like, in 6 years, we're gonna hope to get to X, Y, and Z and whatnot. And I did watch your Paratopia talk like a lot of times, and it was talking about how with our blockchain technology, like we can get to things a lot quicker. And so my hope is, can we start to build solutions where like this time next year we can see some type of impacts, and what would those solutions have to look like?
One idea here is just the experiment, like the one Alan just mentioned about this event, is like if you haven't already gone to that tinyurl.com/sbs-emissions, I just did it. Took me like 1 minute. This is really cool. Let's kind of start putting like an impact meter around offsetting, and not just offsetting to neutral, but like net green on events, and create like a little UI widget that you can, like some image that shows how good it is so far, and just so like we can start a competition between all of the crypto events to see which one is the most green, and not just like in full participation and some multiple, but also in total. Like that would be really cool. Like just get all of these events to start greenifying. But it's one example. I think like there are many other things that we can start trying. Right now, I'm very focused on how do you help new projects start and grow, and how do you support projects that are growing to be able to scale their operation? Because a lot of thought has gone into problems, and we have good candidate solutions, but it's difficult to get them into actually building a thing and getting it good enough that it's going to work well enough to then start scaling. And once it starts scaling, there's all kinds, like the problems just get way bigger. Suddenly everything is way harder. And so as you start scaling, you need a lot of support structures and systems. And so I think one of the things that we could have a lot of impact with is right now, as we're having hackathons for builders in green tech, think of how to support those groups and the people and organizations involved. And let's start thinking about like, let's first instrument like who are all the projects, what scale are they at, what do they need? Let's ask the question of like what help and support they need. Create some real-time feedback loops so that we can get visibility into their ongoing problems, like what's top of mind for them at any given moment in time, or what they project might be important to them a quarter to a year from now. And as we just gather that information, if we just get that in terms of impact, that's going to enable all of us to help those groups much more and start coupling groups that could be working together. It'll do a lot of kind of interconnected problem finding, and then we can connect that to sources of funding, sources of talent, sources of work. There's a massive kind of like gig economy world emerging. So this is an example where things like Airbnb, Uber, Lyft, like all of these kind of like gig economy, sharing economy models, like they were born out of the Web 2 world, and so they have like this community-oriented thing, but with like an extractive Web 2 thing. Create like a Web 3 version of those things to help a lot of these green projects, but make that entire top be regenerative, feeding back funding into the system that not only supports that network, but helps fund new projects and new networks. So like if you're a project that got grant funding from Gitcoin, give back to Gitcoin the next rounds. Like as soon as you're able, give back to the whole system so that other projects can get built, and so that you can benefit from it retroactively, right? Like somebody else, like sort of pay it forward with a multiple. And so I think like something we can do to have impact right now is just let's instrument that pipeline now and just have it as a goal for next year, that we at least know what the projects are, what they're doing, and what they need. Let's just start there, have that, and then from there we can figure out how to support them, how to build structures to help them scale, and so on.
Yeah. The last bit of this question for me is that, the Earth, if the planet is a public good, and like you said, we have the builders of the hackathons that need it, we have the funders, we have the validators. It seems like everybody has a play that has to be happening in order for us to get to this utopia that we all want to drive towards. So I wanted to know, like, who else do we see not only come to the conversation, but like, how can we also better talk to each other about this topic and not be not antagonistic, but also knowing like that people have an actual source of truth and listening to their source of truth and coming together to build a cause. So what needs to happen in order for that little impact shelling points to happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think a ton of it is remembering that we're all, on the same side, right? Trying to bring the same like type of change into the world, right? And that goes within the environmental Web3 space, and also the broader Web3 space, right? Like we're still small, and our competitors is the rest of the world. Our competitor isn't us.
Yeah. Totally. And I also think like, we are Web3 and we can be very like narrow focused, but we have to bring in like D-science and all of these other stuff to actually help us out a lot too. So I want to open the floor up to anyone else who had questions so that we can start to get some of them. I see a couple questions in there. Yeah, Jonathan, if you want to throw it there, and then in the middle, there's one too.
Mike?
Hello. Hi, guys. It's Max Song from Carbon Base and also SBS, Sustainable Bitcoin Standard. One thing that really inspires me from Juan's talk is actually the idea that we can organize kind of global governance systems that are independent of maybe the existing kind of slow hierarchy. And so in reference to Balaji's recent network state, can we actually create a refi nation? Can create a refi nation where individual plots of land are attributed, right? We sort of give carbon credit recognition or renewable energy impact certification to these pieces of land. That money is then used to finance the building of refi nation, right? And actually, eventually, the uptakers are all of the bigger companies are looking to actually, clean up their sins or, clean up their footprint. But this actually starts having a positive feedback loop where you actually have more and more places of land that actually are able to independently access, right, the sort of global refi movement without having to wait for recognition. And so I just want to give you a very concrete story. There's a small country in Suriname, South America. They've been trying to get carbon credits for their standing forest for 20 years, right? They absorb net negative physically 20 million tons. And the guy has been representing himself at the UN, unable to secure financing for his country. And as a result, they've had to resort to cutting down their forests in order to make ends meet. So this is the best perfect test case for refi nation right here. Right? There's a system that is currently inadequate in addressing the actual physical drawdown of CO2, and they're small enough that actually they can easily onboard. So I want to leave that as an open thought experiment for maybe next time we get together for this. Thanks.
How do I submit my citizenship application to refi nation?
Yeah.
What smart contract do I need to send?
I think we should build a coordination.
Yeah.
Ah.
I think there's another.
Thanks for the pity applause, Juan.
No,
Actually,
I
my
just see
question
the-
is about coordination. Like, we want to accelerate things, but coordination is slow. And as a note on maybe also the idea of distributing verifiable processes, to verify distributedly also. We have thought of doing also that bit, but when you get down to the details, how do you incentivize people? Are the people that have the expertise to verify, like attune to the mechanics of our space and the lingo and all that, or do they even want to get into this? So there's many complexities in, it's an awesome idea, but coordinating with them might take longer than we expect. So I wonder, if we have to choose like Occam's razor, 20% of the effort that does the 80% of the results, for you guys, what would that be? What, besides funding and aggregating us here, which is awesome, congratulations to you guys for putting a lot of minds in the space. Huge round of applause to the organizers. Besides coordinating us and funding, which is very good, what other actions do you think are top of the list? The 3 top or the 20% of the actions that we can do?
Yeah, I mean, I think PL, right, has been extremely forward-thinking in just how do you get more people into Web3 generally, right? And there's a whole funnel that Juan talked about. Right, and the environmental Web3 community is sort of a microcosm of that, which has this like unusual property that you need really deep expertise in both Web3 and this other like set of very like technically demanding areas, which might be MRV or might be power grids, right? And so yeah, I mean it's a huge question, right? And I don't think there's just one answer, right? But certainly, conferences where you try to get a bunch of people with deep expertise in at least one, but not necessarily all by any means of these areas together, is part of it. Running the hackathon that we've ran for the past month is part of it. Grants, the Gitcoin climate round is part of that. You need to provide support to people and organizations at sort of every step of their journey, and build pipelines that allow you to do that.
Alan, do you think it's deep expertise or is it deep curiosity? Because one
yeah.
thing that I've seen is like people might not have expertise in the film, but they have a lot of curiosity, and then they start to rabbit hole down and gain their expertise as they go.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
Okay.
I would think about it in terms of building networks. So building networks and movements is a very undervalued thing because networks and movements don't have like a marketing department often, and like a stock that like you can point to that employs a marketing department to like, and so like movements in general and networks tend to, at least these days, tend to be undervalued as a means of having massive impact. And so, but just remember that at the end of the day, it's like if you bring together people and organizations that have some interest in the problem, you talk about the issues. You talk about what are the root causes of the problems. You talk about potential solutions, and you try to explore the design space. And then you coordinate towards some action, whether as a whole group or in subsets, or even individual action. Sometimes like the benefit of bringing a group together is realizing like, hey, actually you disagree, so don't wait on the other group to take some action. Actually do it yourself, because you have to figure it out. But more often than not, you can get a really strong subset in a community or a movement that are going to have significant impact over time, and use movements in terms of bringing people together in a regular cadence with some like very clear like period to it, like either every year, every quarter, whatever it may be, and create a kind of like way of getting everybody to exchange information, resonate, meet each other, build upon their work, and then keep evolving and keep like repeating over time. And movement generation is I think like a key here. So let's scale the SBS movement and bring a lot more people to these sets of conversations. Let's connect it to other similar groups, or create like like I was thinking the other day that we need like a refi conference, like a DevCon scale level refi conference,
Okay.
which would be super awesome. And then think of like things like open source and so on that have started very small, and even open source built on the free software movement, which started very tiny, right? Like Stallman was pissed off at a printer that like wouldn't let him print, and thanks to that we now have like Linux everywhere, right? And thanks to that we now can introspect code, and we have none of this like proprietary software that you can't look at or can't edit or anything like that. You can actually have an upgradable software system, and it all came from Stallman saying, this is completely unacceptable, this is bullshit, I'm going to go and get a lot of other people that agree with me to like fix this problem and create a much better structure. And they started very small, and for a long time they were ostracized and kind of just kind of outcasted for decades, up until that created the grounds for the open source movement that then very pragmatically unified a bunch of communities into a super scalable system. So I think of movement building, think of joining and participating in movements, just resonating with ideas, propagating memes, working on projects, helping each other. All of those things go a long way.
And I think on that note, I do want to plug the Refi Summit, which I think is it happened in Seattle in May, and I think they're doing it again, and we should check in with them again.
All right, so we have, is there one more question? Okay, yeah, we'll go with the one more question.
It's a quick one anyway. I just heard Kevin talking about the impact evaluators being totals all the way down, i.e. you need an impact evaluator for an impact evaluator, and then the complexity explodes basically. And so I was just wondering if you'd thought about stuff like state box and applied category theory in order to limit the complexity growing beyond what's necessary.
I know some of those words is the answer, but send me a link on Twitter. Would love to read more about it. I kind of think of like quadratic funding as an impact evaluator of impact evaluators. Quadratic funding is a way of providing contribution. The funds from the matching pool are allocated according to what the crowd wants to fund. And so basically the way quadratic funding works is that we're building a channel for greater combinations of strength and intelligence to come together. And it's like when each Gitcoin grant is funded through quadratic funding, that's kind of our approach to an impact evaluator for impact DAOs. So that's my experience with it, but curious to learn more about those things that you said, and maybe we can generalize some principles for impact evaluators that manage the complexity.
Well, and I think recursion causes, which I think you were getting at, is like recursion causes complexity, but it also like gives you Turing complete power, right? It's like it's about like having a super general computing substrate because you can go multiple like levels up. But thank you for saying the magic words category theory. They always make me happy.
I'm gonna wrap it up, but before I wrap it up, I wanted to say, Alan, will you just give us the site one more time, and then we can leave with a call of action to go ahead and fill out the form, and then I'll say thank you to all three of you.
Yes, please. It is tinyurl.com/SBS-emissions. So SBS for the Sustainable Blockchain Summit dash emissions. And I think we had 2 submissions on stage. So please do it.
So our time is up, so if you want to fill out the rest of the time by doing that, that would be great. If not, I want to say thank you to Juan and to Alan and to Kevin for sitting with me on this moderation and for giving this talk about how the planet is our public good. So thank you all for joining us, and we appreciate it.
Thank you, Gloria. This is great. I just wanted to mention that I've got this book that I wrote, Green Pill, and I've got copies that I don't want to fly home with, so if you want a copy, come find me outside.
I highly recommend the book. It is like one of the best mimetic masterpieces I have seen in a very long time. Highly recommended.
I will also shill the podcast. Like, the book is great, but I really enjoy the podcast as well, so definitely take a listen to it.
Yeah, those things are great, but have you tried the Tic Tacs? All right, our time is up. Thank you.
Another round of applause, guys.